"Don't look up," someone whispered, just loud enough for her to hear, as if even her gaze had the power to offend them. Lillian Frost kept her eyes lowered, not out of obedience, but because she had learned long ago that meeting their eyes only made it worse. The grand hall stretching wide around her in polished marble and towering columns, chandeliers casting warm golden light that never seemed to reach where she stood, near the far edge of the room where shadows gathered like silent witnesses, her fingers lightly gripping the fabric of her worn blue dress, a dress that had been mended more times than she could count. It seems telling stories no one cared to hear, the hum of voices and soft laughter drifting through the air like a distant current she was never meant to join, nobles in tailored suits and shimmering gowns moving effortlessly across the floor, their confidence as natural as breathing, while she stood still, careful, measured, as if even the wrong step might draw attention she could not afford. A server passing by nearly stumbled, a tray tilting just enough to send a glass trembling, and, without thinking, Lillian reached out, steadying it before it could fall, her touch quick, gentle, unnoticed by everyone except the server, who offered a brief, grateful glance before hurrying away. And for a moment, that was enough, that small act of quiet kindness, something real in a place that felt anything but. Yet it did not take long before the stillness around her shifted, a subtle change in the air, the kind that comes before something breaks, a pair of well-dressed guests slowing as they passed, their eyes flicking toward her with curiosity sharpened into amusement, as if they had discovered something unexpected, something out of place, and decided it might be entertaining. One of them tilting his head slightly, studying her like a puzzle he had already solved. "You're not supposed to be here," he said lightly, though his tone carried no real question, and Lillian said nothing, because silence had always been safer, her heartbeat steady but present, each second stretching just a little longer than the last, more eyes beginning to turn, drawn not by her presence but by the reaction of others, the ripple effect of attention she had tried so hard to avoid, laughter flickering at the edges, soft at first, then growing, not loud enough to cause a scene, but sharp enough to be felt, and still she did not move, did not speak, because she had learned that dignity, once lost, was rarely returned. So she held on to it the only way she knew how, by standing still, by not giving them more than they already took. Somewhere across the room, music played, light and elegant, but here it felt distant, muted beneath the weight of watching eyes, and then, as if guided by some unspoken agreement, one of them reached for a glass of red wine, the liquid catching the chandelier light like something alive, his smile widening just slightly, a moment stretched thin, fragile, balanced on the edge of something inevitable, and Lillian felt it before it happened, not fear exactly, but a quiet knowing, the kind that settles deep in the bones, and still she did not step back, did not flinch, because she refused to give them that satisfaction. Her voice, when it finally came, barely above a breath, steady despite everything. "If you're going to do it," she said softly, "at least don't pretend it's an accident." And for a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause, as if even the air was waiting to see what would come next. The man with the wine did not move right away, as if her words had not only interrupted his intent but unsettled something he did not expect to feel, his smile tightening at the edges while a few nearby guests exchanged glances, their amusement flickering into something sharper, something more interested, because this was no longer just a quiet girl standing in the corner. This was a moment, and moments like this were rare, the kind that drew attention the way fire draws eyes in the dark. "Oh," he said after a beat, lifting the glass slightly as though reconsidering. "You do speak," his tone light, but edged with something colder beneath, and Lillian said nothing more, because she had already said enough, her hands resting calmly at her sides even as her pulse pressed steadily against her ribs, not racing, not panicked, just present, grounded, while the space around them seemed to tighten, conversations nearby softening, shifting, people beginning to notice, not all at once, but enough to feel the weight of it building. The man's companions watching closely now, one of them letting out a small laugh that carried just far enough to invite others to listen. "Careful," she murmured, her voice smooth and amused. She might have more to say, and that drew a few more eyes, a few more smiles, because nothing entertained quite like someone stepping out of their place. even for a second, even if it would cost them. And the man exhaled slowly through his nose, as if deciding that whatever hesitation had crossed his mind was no longer worth keeping, his wrist tilting just slightly, the motion casual, deliberate, unmistakable, and the wine slipped from the glass in a smooth arc, dark red catching the light as it fell, landing across the front of Lillian's dress in a spreading stain that bloomed like ink. On paper, the fabric absorbing it instantly, the color deepening, impossible to ignore. A few gasps sounded, but they were not shocked, not really, more like delighted, like something expected had finally happened. And then the laughter came, soft at first, then growing, not loud enough to echo, but enough to surround her, enough to press in from all sides. And still, she did not move, the liquid cool against her skin through the fabric, a slow drip tracing downward, marking each second, her gaze remaining lowered for one more breath before she finally lifted her eyes, not to challenge, not to plead, but simply to see, to acknowledge what had been done. And in that look there was no anger, no tears, only a quiet steadiness that did not match the situation they had created for her. And that, more than anything, made the laughter falter just slightly, because they had expected something else, embarrassment, perhaps, or panic, something that would complete the moment. But she gave them nothing of the sort, and the man noticed, his expression shifting in a way he tried to hide. "Accidents happen," he said lightly, though the words felt thinner now, less certain, and Lillian tilted her head. "Just a fraction, the faintest movement." "Not like that," she replied, her voice calm, even, as if they were discussing something far less personal, far less deliberate. And for a moment, no one spoke, the air hanging in that fragile space where something could change if given the chance. But someone behind them broke it with another laugh, louder this time, eager to reclaim the tone of the room. "It is just a dress," another voice added, dismissive, as if that settled everything, as if that was all she was, all that mattered. And Lillian let out a slow breath, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric, not to clean it, not to hide it, but simply to feel the weight of it there, grounding herself in the present, reminding herself that this moment would pass, as all moments did, even the ones that lingered longer than they should. And yet, beneath the surface of it all, something else had shifted, something subtle, like the air before a storm that had not yet arrived, a stillness that did not belong to the laughter or the music or the crowded hall, but existed alongside it, unnoticed by most. And Lillian felt it without understanding why, a faint prickle at the back of her awareness, as if somewhere beyond the edges of this moment, someone else had begun to pay attention. The laughter did not fade all at once, but it changed, thinning at the edges as uncertainty slipped quietly into the space it had filled, because something about her stillness refused to complete the scene they had tried to create. Lillian standing exactly where she had been, the dark stain spreading slowly across the fabric of her dress, the scent of wine faint but present, grounding, real, while everything else around her felt distant, almost unreal, like a performance she had not agreed to join, her fingers relaxing at her sides instead of curling inward, her shoulders steady instead of shrinking, and that alone began to draw a different kind of attention, not the quick, careless kind that had sparked the moment, but something more focused, more deliberate, a few voices lowering as people leaned closer to one another, murmuring, reassessing, because they could feel it too now, that subtle shift in the air, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something unseen to arrive. The man who had spilled the wine clearing his throat softly, as if to reclaim control of the moment, his posture straightening, his smile returning though it no longer reached his eyes. "You should be grateful," he said, his tone light but strained. "Now at least you look like you belong to the evening." A few scattered chuckles followed, weaker than before, less certain, and Lillian watched him for a brief second, not long enough to challenge, just long enough to acknowledge. Then her gaze moved past him, drifting across the room without urgency, as if she were searching for something she could not quite name. And that was when she noticed it, not a person, not clearly, but a presence, something that stood apart from the noise and movement, something still, unmoved by the shifting currents of attention, positioned somewhere beyond the immediate circle of onlookers. And though she could not yet see him fully, she felt it, a quiet weight pressing against the edges of the moment, steady and undeniable, her breath catching just slightly before settling again, controlled, measured, while the music continued somewhere behind it all, a soft melody that no longer seemed to belong to this room. Because the room itself had begun to change, the energy folding inward, drawing toward a single point. The conversations thinning further, guests turning one by one, their instincts responding before their minds could catch up, as if something deeper recognized the shift and reacted without permission, and Lillian felt it clearly now, that awareness sharpening, her senses narrowing, the world reducing to the space immediately around her and the unseen figure beyond it, the man in front of her hesitating again, his confidence slipping in ways he did not understand, his eyes flicking briefly over her shoulder before returning, uncertainty flashing and disappearing just as quickly. "I think you have made your point," he added, softer now, almost as if he were speaking to himself as much as to her. But she did not respond, because this was no longer about him. The moment had moved beyond his control, beyond all of them, and even the laughter that lingered at the edges felt misplaced now, fading into something quieter, more cautious, the room adjusting, shifting, realigning itself around a presence that had not yet fully revealed itself, and Lillian stood in the center of it without stepping forward or back, her pulse steady, her expression unchanged, the stain on her dress no longer the focus, no longer the point, because something far more significant had entered the space, something that did not need to announce itself to be felt. And as the silence deepened, spreading like a slow tide across the hall, one truth became impossible to ignore. This moment was no longer theirs to control. The hall grew still in a way that felt almost tangible, the chandeliers flickering slightly as though they were holding their breath alongside everyone present, the murmurs that had hovered in the air dissipating, leaving an almost reverent silence, and Lillian Frost remained where she had been, her posture steady, her eyes meeting nothing and yet taking in everything, the faint scent of wine still lingering faintly on her dress, warming slightly against the cool air of the evening, while somewhere deeper in the hall, the presence she had sensed earlier began to move, not hastily, not with flourish, but with deliberate control, a calm authority that shifted the air itself, a subtle pull that drew the attention of those around him without a single word being spoken, and it was impossible not to feel it, a weight of attention that settled onto Lillian like a quiet tide, compelling the room to lean inward even as the crowd tried to maintain its composure, her heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm as she observed the subtle change, the way shadows seemed to bend just slightly toward the source, the way the light from the chandeliers seemed to catch on polished surfaces, highlighting him in ways that were both commanding and precise. And though she could not see his face clearly at first, she could feel the shift, the weight of eyes that did not merely look but measured, assessed, acknowledged her presence as something different, significant. And she did not flinch, she did not shrink, because years of being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated had taught her the value of standing quietly, letting the world see what it could, giving nothing extra for others to consume. And as he moved closer, the air seemed to change, warmer but charged, like the moment before lightning strikes, a quiet intensity that demanded notice, and the room responded, conversations halting midward, servants pausing in their tasks, the faint clinking of glass stopping, as if the world itself were listening. And when his eyes met hers finally, the effect was immediate, the kind of recognition that did not need explanation, that required no declaration, a single, unspoken understanding passing between them, and Lillian felt it deep within her chest, a stirring of something she had not expected, not fear, not relief, but a quiet acknowledgement that the space she occupied had shifted, that the balance had changed, and she had not moved a muscle, yet everything around her seemed to bend toward him. The authority in his posture, the steadiness in his gaze, the way the edges of the hall seemed to frame him like a portrait designed to command attention. And she knew in that moment that the room would never feel the same, that whatever had begun here, in the soft glow of chandeliers and the polished floors that reflected their images back at them, had changed, and though the wine on her dress remained a reminder of the attempt to humiliate, it now felt almost inconsequential, a mere ripple in the presence of something larger, more deliberate, the crowd sensing it too, their previous confidence giving way to careful observation, eyes following every step, every subtle movement. And Lillian, still calm, still steady, felt a thread of anticipation weaving through her, a quiet understanding that the evening had turned, that the dynamics had shifted. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she recognized that this was only the beginning, the first spark of a moment that would unfold far beyond the constraints of the hall, beyond the polished floors and the chandelier light, reaching towards something neither of them could yet fully name, but both had felt, both had acknowledged in silence. Lillian Frost felt a subtle shift in the energy around her, a current that had been invisible moments ago now pressing gently against her senses, not threatening, not demanding, but undeniable, and she realized that the stillness she had maintained was no longer a shield but a signal, a quiet acknowledgement that she existed in this space on her own terms. The stain of wine cooling on her dress while the lights above glimmered softly, reflecting 1,000 tiny points of gold that seemed to orbit the hall in a pattern only she could sense, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric to anchor herself in the moment. And yet her mind was free to observe, to notice the subtle gestures and shifts of those around her, the way whispers rose and fell like a tide, the tilt of heads, the half-smiles and uncertain glances, as if they were suddenly aware that something had changed, that she was no longer just an accessory to the grandeur, but a presence to be acknowledged, and through it all, she felt the pulse of anticipation, quiet but insistent, threading through the hall like a silver ribbon, guiding her attention toward the figure who had drawn all eyes without a word, his presence like a steady current beneath the surface, pulling gently but firmly, and when he took a single step forward, the entire room seemed to tilt ever so slightly, not physically, but in perception, the guests instinctively shifting their weight, their conversations lowering, their movements measured. The chandeliers above catching the light at angles that seemed to highlight him, casting soft reflections across polished floors and mirrored surfaces, and Lillian could see him clearly now, not just as a shadow at the edge of her awareness, but as a defined figure, tall, composed, each motion precise, deliberate, unhurried, radiating authority that required no proclamation, the kind of presence that made others pause without them realizing why. And her gaze held steady, capturing the quiet intensity, feeling a resonance that was unspoken yet profoundly felt, the warmth of the wine on her dress a faint memory, its significance reduced to nothing by the magnitude of this shift, as if the moment had expanded to encompass more than herself, more than the hall, the chandeliers, the murmuring guests, a silent acknowledgement that the evening had changed in a way that would not soon be forgotten. The air itself seemed to pulse with it, carrying an almost imperceptible vibration through the room, tickling the edges of awareness, and Lillian recognized the subtle rise of tension, not the kind that demanded reaction, but the kind that invited reflection, a sense of being part of a larger narrative unfolding beyond her immediate comprehension, and she breathed deeply, grounding herself, feeling the weight and stillness simultaneously, the quiet hum of anticipation threading through her, while the hall responded as one entity, sensing the presence and shifting, aligning, folding inward, a living, breathing space momentarily suspended, and as the figure approached, each step purposeful, controlled, measured, she felt the gravitational pull of attention, not merely from the room but from the subtle currents of something larger, a force that acknowledged her, welcomed her without words, the murmurs now reduced to whispers, the eyes of those around flicking with curiosity, uncertainty, a dawning realization that the evening had taken a turn, and Lillian remained poised, serene, ready to meet it, to exist fully in the awareness of all that had changed, her breath steady, her heartbeat measured, her mind attuned to the subtleties of movement and energy, and though the hall was still alive with the faint echoes of reaction, she felt a quiet exhilaration, a deep satisfaction in knowing that she had reached this point without compromise, standing firmly in her presence as the currents of attention and energy converged around her, marking the transition from observer to recognized participant, the room holding its collective breath, waiting, and she, too, waited, steady and calm, fully aware of the transformation unfolding. Before her, Lillian Frost took a steadying breath, feeling the soft press of the polished marble beneath her shoes as if the hall itself were lending her strength. The wine stain no longer a mark of shame but a silent testament to the attention she had drawn, her shoulders straight, her hands relaxed at her sides, and in that calm, deliberate stance, she began to notice the subtle ripple of awareness among the guests, the way whispers softened, the way gazes lingered a fraction longer, the way the energy of the room bent gently toward her, not aggressively, not demanding, but with a measured curiosity that made the air feel electric. And she realized in that moment that she was no longer merely present, she was observed, acknowledged, a participant in a scene she had never intended to join, yet had navigated with careful poise, her eyes sweeping briefly over the crowd, catching glimmers of surprise and hesitation, a few softened expressions where amusement had once been, and that shift, quiet and imperceptible to many, resonated deeply, affirming her steady resolve. And then she sensed him again, the figure whose presence had first drawn the attention of the room, moving with deliberate grace, each step measured, unhurried, yet powerful, commanding without a single word, the kind of authority that made the chandeliers above seem to shimmer slightly more, the reflections across the polished floors glinting in alignment with his careful approach, and Lillian felt a pull, a subtle yet insistent awareness that the moment she had occupied for so long was now part of a larger current, drawing her attention as much as the attention of those around her, the energy shifting, gathering, coalescing around him, and she could feel the anticipation in the room like a quiet tide pressing against her senses, compelling focus, inviting acknowledgement, and her breath remained steady, controlled, a quiet anchor amidst the tension, the fabric of her dress brushing lightly against her legs as if to remind her of her grounding in this space, while the soft hum of conversation in the periphery gradually ebbed, replaced by a collective stillness that carried a weight of expectation, the kind that left no room for pretense, only observation, only acknowledgement of presence, and Lillian felt it keenly, the awareness that the hall itself had shifted subtly in response to him, to the gravity of his quiet authority, and yet she remained calm, poised, unyielding, her own stillness echoing the measured control she now recognized in the figure approaching, whose gaze, when it finally met hers, held an intensity that was both precise and considerate, not challenging, not demanding, but acknowledging, as if noting her steadiness, her quiet courage, her composed presence amidst the subtle chaos of social currents that had ebbed and flowed until this point. And in that gaze, she sensed an unspoken connection, a recognition of composure, of being seen for more than the wine-stained dress, more than the expectations and the whispers, more than the curated appearances and the careful facades, an acknowledgement that she had occupied this moment fully, deliberately, with her own quiet authority, and as he drew slightly closer, the room seemed to respond as one, the faintest shift in energy, the gentle alignment of attention, the softening of expressions, a quiet confirmation that what had begun as a moment of disruption had transformed into a moment of presence, a subtle but undeniable change in the atmosphere. And Lillian, still grounded, still steady, allowed herself a small, private inhale, feeling the weight of observation and acknowledgement settling around her, the hall holding its collective breath, the chandeliers shimmering softly above, and for the first time in the evening, she felt entirely in control of her space, fully aware of her presence, and the way the currents of attention had bent to include her. Lillian Frost felt the subtle shift of attention continue. A gentle pull of eyes and energy that threaded through the room like a current she could sense more than see. The chandeliers above casting a soft glow that danced on the polished marble floors and flickered against the walls lined with gilded mirrors, catching reflections that seemed to magnify the stillness and precision of her stance. And she noticed that the crowd had grown quieter. The once soft murmurs now subdued, conversations paused mid-sentence as the presence that had drawn the attention earlier moved closer with deliberate ease, his steps measured, assured, a rhythm that drew the room into alignment without a single spoken word. And Lillian, sensing the subtle power of the moment, allowed herself a calm inhale, feeling the warmth of the air shift slightly as the current of acknowledgement settled around her, the fabric of her dress still carrying the faint trace of wine, yet it no longer mattered. The moment transcending the small disruption it had begun with. She could feel the eyes of the guests tracing the path of the approaching figure, noticing the deliberate strength in each motion, the quiet authority that demanded recognition, and she met his gaze steadily, not with challenge, not with fear, but with a composed acknowledgement that she was present, here, visible, existing fully in the space he had now entered, and the subtle energy that moved between them was palpable, a silent thread that drew attention, focusing it on them without fanfare, without the need for dramatic gestures. The hall itself seeming to bend slightly toward the stillness they shared, the faint echoes of movement around them slowing, as if the walls and floors conspired to preserve this delicate alignment. And she noted the small shifts in posture, the soft straightening of shoulders, the brief inclinations of heads, the way hands fell to sides or stilled, as if each individual sensed the weight of the moment and chose to respond with care, a collective, unconscious choreography that gave space for the presence she had felt before to anchor itself firmly within the hall. The subtle warmth of the chandelier light reflecting on polished surfaces like glimmers of attention, drawing out small highlights on the figure's attire, the edges of shadows shifting softly around them. And in that concentrated pause, Lillian felt a surge of quiet certainty, a recognition of her own agency within the space, the power of being seen not as a spectacle, but as a participant in the unfolding narrative of the evening. And the longer he moved, the more she sensed the hall adjusting. The currents of attention folding into a rhythm dictated by subtle presence and deliberate poise, the energy quiet but unmistakable, compelling even those further from the center to feel it, to note it, and the murmurs that had lingered at the edges receded, leaving a space in which the hall itself seemed to inhale, a suspended breath that she could feel through the tips of her fingers and the weight of her feet on the marble, the awareness stretching outward from the pair of them, touching walls, mirrors, chandeliers, and finally settling on the crowd who now watched without pretense, without amusement, holding still in anticipation, and Lillian, calm, grounded, allowed the presence of the figure, approaching to become part of her perception, aligning with the quiet confidence she had cultivated through years of being overlooked, the fabric of her dress brushing lightly against her skin, grounding her in the here and now, a reminder that while the room shifted, she remained herself, poised, steady, fully present, the space around her charged with a quiet acknowledgement of her presence. And as he drew closer still, the hall seemed to embrace the suspension, the soft tension between movement and stillness, the subtle exchange of acknowledgement passing without a single word, leaving the air thick with anticipation, the light warm and measured, and Lillian stood steady, sensing that this was a moment of recognition, of attention earned through stillness, presence, and quiet composure, a moment that would linger in memory long after the candles had burned down and the guests had departed. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling over the hall like a held breath that no one dared release. And Lillian Frost felt it clearly now, not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier, something deliberate, as the figure closed the remaining distance between them, his steps slowing until he stopped just a few feet away, close enough that the warmth of his presence shifted the air around her, close enough that every eye in the room sharpened its focus, and still, he said nothing, his gaze resting on her with an intensity that was not invasive but precise, as if he were seeing her fully, not the dress, not the stain, not the assumptions that had been thrown at her moments before, but her, and that alone sent a quiet ripple through the crowd, because they felt it too, that difference, that shift in attention that no longer aligned with their earlier amusement. The man who had spilled the wine shifting his weight slightly, a small movement that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness, his confidence thinning under the weight of the moment, and for the first time since it had begun, he glanced away, just briefly, as if searching for support that was no longer there. And Lillian noticed it without turning her head, without breaking. The steady line of her posture, her breathing even, controlled, the fabric of her dress cool against her skin where the wine had settled, grounding her in the present, while the room seemed to hold itself in suspension around them, waiting, watching, and then, finally, the man in front of her spoke, his voice low, calm, carrying without effort. Are you all right? The question simple, direct, but it did not sound like a formality. It sounded like a choice, like a decision to acknowledge what had been done without amplifying it, without turning it into something louder than it needed to be. And Lillian blinked once, the smallest movement, not because she was surprised, but because she understood the weight of the moment, the care in the question, and she answered just as simply. I am, her voice steady, unshaken, and for a brief second, something passed between them, something unspoken but clear, an understanding that did not need explanation. And then his gaze shifted, just slightly, not away from her, but beyond her, toward the others, toward the ones who had created the moment. And the change was immediate, subtle but undeniable, the air tightening just a fraction, the crowd responding without realizing it, shoulders straightening, eyes lowering, the earlier laughter now completely gone, replaced by a quiet awareness that the balance had shifted, that the space they occupied was no longer theirs to control. And he did not raise his voice, did not make a scene, did not call attention in the way they had expected. Instead, he simply stood there, present, unwavering, and that presence alone was enough to quiet the room, enough to erase the remnants of mockery, enough to redefine the moment without a single dramatic gesture. And Lillian felt it, the way the tension eased, not because it disappeared, but because it was redirected, transformed into something else, something steadier, something that belonged to him now. And the man with the wine cleared his throat again, softer this time, uncertain. It was just a misunderstanding, he offered, the words falling flat in the quiet, lacking the confidence they had carried before. And no one laughed, no one agreed, because the room had already moved past that, had already aligned itself with the new center of gravity standing just in front of her. And Lillian remained still, her gaze calm, her presence unchanged. But inside, she felt the shift settle, the recognition that this moment, this exact moment, had turned, and there was no going back to what it had been before. The man's explanation lingered in the air for a moment, thin and fragile, as if even he did not believe it would hold. And Lillian Frost felt the weight of that silence press gently against her senses, not uncomfortable, not overwhelming, but clarifying, like the stillness after something inevitable had finally revealed itself. And she did not rush to fill it, did not move to soften it, because she understood now that silence could speak more clearly than any defense. Her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, the faint scent of wine still present but no longer defining, no longer the center of the moment. And the figure standing before her remained still as well, his presence anchoring the room in a way that no raised voice ever could, the quiet authority in him drawing a line that no one seemed willing to cross. And then, after a measured pause, he spoke again, his tone even, controlled. Misunderstandings are usually followed by apologies. The words simple, almost casual, yet they carried through the hall with a clarity that left no room for dismissal. And the effect was immediate. The man who had spoken before shifting again, this time more noticeably, his composure slipping just enough for it to be seen, his eyes flicking briefly toward the others beside him, searching for support that no longer existed. The earlier confidence now replaced with something quieter, something uncertain, and for a moment, no one spoke, because the expectation had changed, the rules of the room rewritten without announcement, and Lillian watched it unfold without interfering, without stepping forward, because this was not her battle to claim. It was simply a moment she had endured, a space she had held. And now the balance had shifted in her favor without her needing to reach for it. And finally, the man exhaled. Softly, the sound almost lost in the stillness. I apologize, he said, the words careful, measured, not quite meeting her eyes at first, then forcing himself to do so. And even then, there was a hesitation, a recognition that the apology was not entirely his choice. But it was spoken nonetheless, and the room absorbed it, the tension easing just slightly, not disappearing, but transforming into something quieter, something resolved. And Lillian inclined her head just a fraction, acknowledging it without amplifying it, without granting it more significance than it deserved, because she knew that true dignity did not demand attention. It simply existed, steady and unshaken, and the figure in front of her seemed to recognize that as well. his gaze returning to her for a brief second, not lingering, not intrusive, just enough to confirm that the moment had been seen, understood, and then he turned slightly. The smallest shift in posture signaling that the focus of the room could move. Again, that the tension had served its purpose, and almost instantly, the hall responded, the held breath releasing in soft waves. Conversations beginning to stir again at the edges, cautious at first, then gradually returning, though quieter than before, more aware, more measured, and Lillian remained where she was, her presence unchanged, but inside, she felt the difference. The quiet settling of something that had been uncertain before, a recognition that she had stood her ground without resistance, without force, and had been seen, truly seen, in a way that did not depend on status or approval. And as the energy of the room slowly resumed its rhythm, she allowed herself a small, steady breath. Her fingers relaxing at her sides, the fabric of her dress still marked but no longer significant, because the moment had moved beyond it. And though the music began to rise again, soft and elegant, it no longer felt distant, it felt present, part of the same space she now occupied fully, and for the first time that evening, she understood that the role she had been given by others no longer defined her place in the room, because something had shifted, something quiet but irreversible, and she had not moved at all to make it happen. The music returned first, soft and cautious, like it was asking permission to exist again, the gentle notes slipping back into the space between conversations that had not fully recovered, and Lillian Frost remained still for a moment longer, allowing the shift to settle completely, the apology still echoing faintly in her mind, not as a victory, not as a wound healed, but as a quiet confirmation that the moment had ended on her terms. Her shoulders relaxed just slightly, not in relief, but in release. The tension that had once pressed against her now dissolved into something lighter, something she could carry without effort, and she became aware again of the hall in full, the warmth of the chandeliers above, the soft movement of fabric as guests resumed their paths, the faint clink of glass returning in careful increments. And yet, beneath all of it, something had changed, something that did not revert with the music or the conversations, because the attention that had once been sharp and dismissive had softened into something else, something observant, respectful in a way it had not been before, and she could feel it in the way people no longer looked through her, but at her, briefly, subtly, without the earlier amusement, and that alone marked a difference she could not ignore. And then she felt it again, that presence beside her, not imposing, not demanding, but steady, grounded, as if it had always belonged there. And when she turned her gaze slightly, she found him. Still close, closer than before, not by much, but enough that the distance between them no longer felt like separation. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet between them not empty but full, carrying the weight of everything that had just unfolded. And then he moved, not away, but just enough to reach for something at his side, the motion smooth, unhurried, drawing a few lingering glances from those still watching, and without ceremony, he removed his coat, a dark, well-fitted piece that held the faint sheen of fine fabric under the chandelier light, and before she could question it, before she could step back or refuse, he placed it gently over her shoulders, the weight of it settling around her like a quiet shield, warm, grounding, unmistakable in its intent, and the room noticed, not loudly, not with gasps or whispers, but with a collective awareness that rippled outward, subtle yet undeniable, and Lillian felt it immediately, the warmth of the fabric, the faint scent of something clean and steady, something that did not belong to the chaos of the moment before, and her breath paused for just a second, not in surprise, but in recognition of what the gesture meant. Not protection in the obvious sense, not pity, but acknowledgement, a quiet correction of what had been done without turning it into spectacle, and she lifted her eyes to him, meeting his gaze fully now, searching not for answers but for understanding, and what she found there was calm, deliberate, unwavering, as if this had never been a question for him, as if the choice had been made the moment he noticed, and she did not thank him right away, did not rush to fill the silence with words, because something told her that this moment did not need them, that the gesture itself had already said everything it needed to. And around them, the room continued to shift, conversations resuming but softer, more careful, the earlier tension replaced with a quiet awareness that lingered in the background, shaping the way people moved, the way they looked, and Lillian stood there, the coat resting securely around her shoulders, the stain beneath it hidden. Now, not erased but no longer visible, and she understood then that the night had drawn a line, a before and after that could not be undone, and she had stepped across it without even realizing when it happened. The weight of the coat settled more fully around Lillian Frost's shoulders as the seconds passed, the warmth seeping through the thin fabric of her dress and grounding her in a way she had not expected, and she became aware of how still she was standing, how quiet the space between her and the man beside her had become, not empty, but intentional, as if both of them understood that anything spoken now would carry more meaning than before. And she lifted her chin just slightly, not in defiance, not in pride, but in quiet acknowledgement of the moment they now shared, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the coat, feeling the smooth texture beneath her touch, the subtle weight of something that did not belong to her yet had been placed there without hesitation, and for the first time since the evening began, she allowed herself to fully look at him, not just in passing, not just through the haze of shifting attention, but directly, steadily, taking in the details she had only sensed before, the composed stillness in his posture, the quiet control in the way he carried himself, the kind of presence that did not need to prove anything because it already was. And when their eyes met again, there was no uncertainty in his gaze, no question, only a calm recognition that mirrored her own, and it was that, more than the coat, more than the silence of the room, that made something inside her shift, something small but undeniable, like a door opening just enough to let light through, and around them. The hall had resumed its rhythm, but not completely, not in the way it had been before, because the awareness lingered, subtle but present, shaping the way conversations unfolded, the way glances were cast, the way space was given without being asked for, and Lillian could feel it in the way no one stepped too close now, the way the circle around them remained just slightly wider than before, as if the room itself had agreed to acknowledge what had happened, without speaking it aloud. And then, after a moment that stretched just long enough to be remembered, he spoke, his voice low, measured, carrying only to her. "You handled that well." The words simple, almost understated, but there was no condescension in them, no hint of surprise, only a quiet statement of fact, and Lillian exhaled softly, not a sigh, but a release of something she had been holding without realizing it, her gaze steady as she answered, "I did what I had to," her voice calm, even, matching his in tone if not in depth, and for a brief second, something almost like approval flickered in his expression, not overt, not exaggerated, but enough to be seen if one was paying attention, and she was, more than she had expected to be, because this moment felt different from the others that had come before, not shaped by expectation or judgment, but by something quieter, something more deliberate, and she found herself standing just a fraction straighter, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to meet him on equal ground, to hold the same steady presence he carried so effortlessly. And then he inclined his head slightly, a gesture small enough to be missed by most, but intentional, precise. "Sebastian," he said, offering his name without title, without embellishment, as if that alone was enough, and Lillian felt the weight of it settle, not as a revelation, but as a confirmation of something she had already sensed, and she responded in kind. "Lillian." Her voice just as steady, just as composed, the exchange simple, direct, yet carrying more weight than any formal introduction could have, and for a moment, they simply stood there, two names shared in the quiet space between them, while the world around them continued to move in softened tones and careful rhythms, and Lillian realized then that this was not just the end of what had happened, but the beginning of something else, something that had not been planned, not expected, but had arrived all the same, and she did not rush away from it, did not retreat back into the edges of the room, because for the first time, she did not feel the need to disappear, the coat still resting around her shoulders, the warmth steady, the presence beside her unwavering, and the night, once distant and overwhelming, now felt close, immediate, and entirely hers to stand within. The name lingered between them longer than expected, not because it was unfamiliar, but because of the way it had been offered, without weight, without title, as if it carried its own certainty without needing anything else to support it. And Lillian Frost felt that quiet confidence settle into the space around her, blending with the warmth of the coat still resting on her shoulders, grounding her in a moment that no longer felt fragile, no longer felt like something that could be taken away, and she became aware of the subtle shift in her own breathing, deeper now, steadier, as if her body had finally recognized that the tension had passed, that the room no longer held the same sharp edges it had before, and yet, the awareness of being seen remained, not in the uncomfortable way it had begun, but in something calmer, more deliberate, the kind of attention that did not press or demand, but acknowledged, and she let herself stand within it, not shrinking, not stepping back into the shadows where she had started the evening, because that space no longer called to her in the same way, and around them, the hall had resumed its movement. But it was different now, the conversation softer, the laughter more measured, the glances more careful, as if everyone present understood, even without words, that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and Lillian could feel it in the way no one brushed past her without awareness, the way space opened just slightly as she moved, the way her presence was no longer ignored but quietly respected, and it was not loud, not dramatic, but it was real, and that was enough, more than enough, and she turned her gaze briefly away from Sebastian, letting her eyes sweep across the room once more, not searching this time, but observing, taking in the details she had missed before, the soft flicker of candlelight reflecting in crystal glasses, the muted tones of conversation blending into a gentle hum, the subtle choreography of movement as guests navigated the space. With renewed awareness, and for the first time, she did not feel like an outsider looking in. She felt like part of it, not because she had changed who she was, but because the way she was seen had shifted. And that realization settled quietly within her, steady and unshaken. And when she looked back at him, she found his attention still present, not intrusive, not overwhelming, but intentional, as if he had chosen to remain in this moment rather than move on from it. And that choice carried a weight she did not ignore, because she understood that someone like him did not linger without reason, and yet, there was no pressure in it, no expectation placed on her, only a quiet openness that allowed the moment to exist as it was, and she found herself appreciating that more than anything else, the absence of demand, the space to simply be, and she shifted slightly, adjusting the coat around her shoulders, not to hide, but to settle it more comfortably, acknowledging its presence without self-consciousness, and he noticed, not with a comment, but with a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming that the gesture had served its purpose, and that was enough, and the music swelled just slightly in the background, filling the space with a warmth that matched the glow of the chandeliers above, and Lillian felt the evening continue, not as something she had to endure, but as something she could choose to remain within, her posture relaxed yet steady, her presence fully her own, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to simply exist in it, in the balance of quiet and movement, of awareness and ease, of being seen and still being herself, and it felt different, not overwhelming, not uncertain, but right, in a way she had not expected when she first stepped into the hall, and she understood then that this moment was not just an ending, not just the resolution of what had happened, but a turning point, a quiet shift in direction that would carry forward beyond this room, beyond this night, into something she could not yet define but could already feel, steady and certain beneath the surface, like a path unfolding one step at a time. The night did not rush forward. It unfolded, slow and deliberate, as if it understood that something quiet but permanent had taken place within its walls, and Lillian Frost stood in the center of it no longer as someone trying to remain unseen, but as someone who had been witnessed and recognized without asking for it. The weight of the coat still resting around her shoulders like a quiet promise she had not expected to receive, its warmth steady against her skin, grounding her in the present while the world around her continued in softened tones, conversations weaving gently through the space, laughter returning but never quite reaching the careless sharpness it once had. And she could feel it, that subtle shift in how the room held her now, not as an afterthought, not as something easily dismissed, but as someone whose presence carried meaning, and she did not need to question it, did not need to test it, because it existed in the small details, in the way eyes met hers briefly instead of passing over her, in the way space was offered rather than taken, in the way the energy around her had settled into something calm and respectful, and beside her, Sebastian remained, not speaking, not moving away, his presence, as steady as it had been from the moment he stepped into her awareness, and she realized that he had not stayed out of obligation, not out of curiosity, but because he had chosen to, and that choice carried more weight than any grand gesture ever could, and for a moment, she allowed herself to stand within that understanding, to feel it fully without pulling back, without questioning whether she deserved it, because something inside her had shifted as well, something that no longer asked for permission to exist, and she turned her gaze slightly toward the far end of the hall, taking in the glow of candlelight reflecting off glass and polished stone, the quiet elegance of movement around her, the steady rhythm of an evening that had regained its balance, but not its previous indifference. And she understood then that this was not just a single moment that would fade when the night ended. It was a beginning, subtle but undeniable, the kind that did not announce itself, but changed everything all the same. And she drew a slow breath, feeling the calm settle deeper within her, her fingers brushing once more against the edge of the coat, as if to confirm that it was real, that this had happened, that she had stood in that moment and remained unbroken, unchanged in who she was, yet seen in a way she had never been before. And as she exhaled, she heard his voice again, quiet, close, meant only for her. You should not have to stand alone. The words simple, but they carried something deeper beneath them, not a command, not a promise, but an acknowledgement, and she turned her head just enough to meet his gaze once more, her expression calm, steady, but her eyes holding something new, something that had not been there at the beginning of the night, and she answered just as quietly, I did not. And for the briefest second, something shifted between them, something unspoken but understood, and the music swelled gently in the background, the hall continuing its quiet motion around them. But Lillian knew that when she walked out of this place, she would not be the same person who had entered it, not because the world had changed, but because she had, in a way that could not be undone. And as she stood there, no longer at the edge, no longer unseen, she understood that this was only the beginning, and somewhere deep within that understanding, there was a quiet certainty, steady and unshaken, that the next time the world tried to overlook her, it would find that she was no longer someone who could be ignored.